Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have a special presentation here. We're going to inject another presentation into our lunch due to scheduling, but I think you guys will like what we're doing here. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Ron Ross. He is a senior computer scientist and fellow at National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. His current areas of specialization include information security, testing, evaluation, and risk management. Dr. Ross leads the FISMA implementation project. He is a 3-time recipient of the Federal 100 Award for his leadership and technical contributions to critical information security projects, specifically in the federal government and DoD. Dr. Ross has served to the White House aide as a senior technical advisor to the Department of Army. Dr. Ross is a graduate of the Defense Systems Management College and holds a master's and PhD in computer science from the United States Naval Academy.
Hi, can you guys all hear me okay? Good? Great. Well, thanks very much for having me in today. This is a great conference. First time I've ever been to LASCON. Last time I was in Austin was about 40 years ago. I was actually stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, and this was the only place to go on the weekends to find some excitement back in those days. So Austin's really grown a lot, great city. I understand this conference next year might be the OWASP conference writ large, so that's really good to see that it's coming to Texas. A great place to have a conference. All right, we're getting it. All right, how's that? Better? How about that? There we go. Good, great. All right, we got about, I think, maybe half hour, 35, 40 minutes to talk a little bit about cybersecurity, the focus of this conference. At the federal government level, we are trying to do our best to develop the kind of standards and guidelines that can be useful to our customers. And our customers have a range of applications, if you will, across the entire federal space, from the Central Intelligence Agency to the Department of Homeland Security to DOJ, Department of Agriculture, and all the contractors that support the federal government. So our standards and guidelines are required for the federal government and our contractors. They're voluntary for all of you in the private sector who want to use those standards and guidelines in whatever area you might be. I want to start out with the threat because that is always what we have to focus on today. And those of you who have been in this business more than 5 or so years will really appreciate that the threat space today is really exponentially growing with regard to the number, the types of malware being produced, the sophistication of the attacks. We see from the very high-end attacks like Stuxnet, that's one of the classic examples of the advanced persistent threat that we see. And Stuxnet was a very important attack because it took place over about 18 months. And the first year of that attack was nothing more than a reconnaissance mission. The adversary penetrated. There were 4 zero-day vulnerabilities that were exploited. They compromised some digital certificates, lots of routine stuff that wasn't quite buttoned down like it should have been. Got into the system, and their whole mission for that first year was to understand how that power plant operated, what the people's schedules looked like, what the architecture looked like, how things were hooked together, the information flows throughout the system. And when that 1 year was over, they took the information and they built the perfect payload. And that really, the rest is history. We now have the example of a cyber attack taking down a nuclear power generator 10,000 miles away. Where we don't, no one really knows where the attack was originated. We don't get into those things, but it doesn't make a lot of difference. Our critical infrastructure today, 90% of our critical infrastructure, energy, finance, transportation, 90% outside of the federal government's control. State and local governments and private sector. This is why what you do as professionals is so important, both for national security purposes and for economic security. Because if you look at the APT today, adversaries want to do one of two things. They either want to take you down, take your capability down, like taking down the air traffic control system, losing the command and control for the airspace. That's a capability that they would like to take down if if they could find the opportune time to do that, those kinds of things could be devastating. But the more surreptitious attack is when the system is kept operational and their whole intent is to exfiltrate information, steal stuff. This doesn't have to be top secret information coming out of the Pentagon. This could be cutting-edge technologies being developed by small, medium, and large-sized companies. It could be the next generation automobile designs coming out of General Motors or Ford Motor Company. You see, with exfiltration and the sophistication of the attacks today, this is the slow bleed that can have a long-term debilitating effect on both economic and national security interests. That's why your jobs today have never been more important. The information security officer, the CISO, anybody who's in an organization, the senior leaders absolutely rely on you for good advice. Because in every organization today, technology is the driver. And in order to be successful in the missions that we have to carry out, whether it's federal, state, local, or private sector, that information technology has to be dependable. And in order for it to be dependable, it must be protected. Talk about the red zone, because I know this conference I was asking before I came up, what's the breakdown? We have about 80% of the folks here are technical, and about 20% are on the management side. That's a good thing, because this slide really talks to the 80% of the technologists who we really need to have called into action to talk about the red zone. The red zone, for you football fans, I guess we're down in Texas country now, so we have the Longhorns, we have all the professional teams down in Texas, but the red zone is the final 20 yards before you go in for a touchdown. And I use this analogy with regard to cybersecurity because 80% of the cyber attacks that we see today, and we have access to all of the classified threat data. We can tell you where the attacks are coming from. We can tell you how they're constructed. We can tell you where they're targeting and which ones have been successful. 80% or more can be stopped by best practices, things that you would do routinely coming out of our standards and guidelines at NIST or any of the other security standards that are typically out there today. But having said that, there's that percentage of attacks from 80 to 100 that cannot be stopped by conventional means. This is the red zone. The red zone attacks are the ones we really have to worry about. Now, the message here is today, with regard to cybersecurity, we have to get a lot better at doing the 80% routinely. Best practices, good housekeeping, low-hanging fruit, whatever the word is, we got to get really good at that and do it routinely. It's got to be built into the infrastructure, just the way we do business. Because we have to take your brain power and apply it to the 20% that's really going to do us damage as a nation long term. That's the part we have to focus on. Unconventional threats. A lot of the technology folks, we're worried about firewalls and access control, two-factor authentication, encryption, all the stuff under the hood. But these are the things still today that are causing us great concern at the federal level, and I'm assuming that the same thing in the private sector. Unconventional threats, because you don't see these when you go to the conventional open source literature about threats. Complexity, connectivity, and culture, the 3 C's, and they really can be devastating. If your organization is overly bureaucratic, you're not going to be lean and mean enough to stop these cyber attacks, because today it's all about flexibility and agility, being able to move quickly, being in the operations tempo of the adversary. These adversaries work very quickly. They've got lots of smart people working 24/7, developing new malware, and there's been an exponential growth in malware. And so those antiviral programs that we used to rely on to catch 85, 95% of those instances of malware, that level has gone down to 50% or less now, because there's an explosive growth in malware. They're producing it more quickly. So our great companies, like Symantec and McAfee and all the ones that work in that space, are going to different techniques now. In addition to signatures, they're going to reputation-based protection. Innovation is critical in our business, always will be. We've always have new technologies coming along, cloud computing, mobile computing, wireless about 10, 15, 20 years ago. We don't know how to do cyber initially in these areas, but we figure it out, and then we apply what we know. It always goes back to applying the fundamentals of security to whatever new technology comes down the pike. I call it the physics of security. And these are the fundamentals that you know and use every single day in your operations and your businesses. Complexity, though, is the one that really is going to bring us down. I would argue today that we have so much information technology, And we have such poor practices in how we engineer the enterprise architecture and we engineer our systems using all those commercial products that we are asking our CISOs and our CIOs to defend the impossible in some cases. We're building systems in many cases that are indefensible with regard to some of these cyber attacks. That's why you're going to see in the NIST strategy that was rolled out in the new 800-39 publication. It's called Enterprise-Wide Risk Management, 839. It's on our website. We're focusing now on the strategic level of risk management, and that's going to be a really different way to approach the problem. I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides here, because our digital footprint that we have today is getting too big. Everything that you touch with whatever device you're using, a mobile device, a laptop, a workstation, mainframes are still around in a big way. Every time we connect to the network or we interact with that technology, we're leaving our footprint. As the footprint becomes larger, we become more vulnerable. Our strategy up to this point, I use the analogy of a car. We have the hood up, and we're looking at the engine compartment. We're looking at every single piece of that engine. We're micromanaging. And you guys all know this is the way we do business today. Every Tuesday, we go out and look for the latest patches coming down from all the big vendors. We are in a constant hunt for vulnerabilities. The problem is we have such complex hardware and software and firmware and the systems we're building, there will be an endless supply of these vulnerabilities because of the inherent weaknesses and deficiencies that are in the commercial software that's produced today. It's large, it's complex, and with any large software development effort, as you all know, those of you who are in the software business, you're always going to have lots of weaknesses and deficiencies in that code. And you'll never be able to test every branch of that code and wring out every vulnerability. So we literally have hundreds and thousands of these weaknesses and deficiencies, and a percentage of those can be exploited by adversaries, and we call those vulnerabilities. So we're chasing these vulnerabilities endlessly. It's like having one of those colanders with the spaghetti that's draining, and you have hundreds of holes in one piece of bubble gum to stop it up. We're never going to get ahead using that kind of a strategy. So what do we do instead? Let's take a step back and see what kind of an automobile do we want. Let's don't look at the engine first. What kind of a car do we need? What's the characteristics, performance-wise? And you can equate this to resiliency in information systems. Because at the end of the day, the adversaries respect one thing: the penetration resistance, strength of mechanism, resiliency of systems, and if you can't stop every cyber attack, which we can't, then once those adversaries get through the boundary, then we have to be able to limit the damage they do once they're in the system. And we have to be able to do like the military does. We have to operate while under attack, and that's a new paradigm today that a lot of folks haven't been thinking about previously. Because we had this assumption we could stop them all. We know now that we can't. So our strategy is to try to build better systems through enterprise architecture and engineering techniques. And the future is going to look very different. You know, when an organization today sits down and figures out their core missions and their business operations, the next thing they usually do is develop what we call mission or business processes. These are the actual processes that maybe payroll or logistics, and information flows through processes to get the mission accomplished. And once you define the mission and business processes, you then construct the enterprise architecture, which is going to drive how the systems are built at the next level down. Now today, when we look at designing our mission and our business processes, we in most cases are not looking at the threat. And I'm going to argue today that when you are in an organization, you have to have folks like you in the same room as the enterprise architects and the mission and business owners. Because as they're designing these mission and business processes, they had better understand what the threat is capable of, so they can design those processes to be risk aware. And risk aware means understanding what the threats are, capabilities, intent, and targeting. Those are the three characteristics that the intelligence community uses to describe the adversary: capability, intent, and targeting. And with those characteristics, then, you can understand what you're up against. And you have to start the process of building those mission business processes early in the life cycle, so you can build into those the requisite strength necessary to deal with these advanced, persistent, and cyber threats. Now, once we get the mission business processes designed, we now have to work on the architecture. Consolidation, standardization, optimization. We have way, way, way too much IT today. It grows almost unconstrained. And we're putting an unnecessary and an impossible burden on every one of you in asking you to defend this overly complex infrastructure. It can't be done. So the only thing we can do is reduce and manage that complexity. Standardize, optimize, consolidate. In essence, building leaner and meaner IT infrastructures. And then, not only do you get more efficient services, but you get a better laydown for how the cybersecurity folks can allocate their safeguards and countermeasures to the infrastructure, both within the systems on the technology side and within the environment of operations, the personnel security, the guards, guns, and gates, all the things that deal with the operational and management aspects of our business. So using technology wisely then is the next step after you build a good enterprise architecture. Just because you can go out and buy that new pad technology or use that smartphone doesn't mean you always should use that device, especially with some critical applications and missions that are going on in your organizations. We see this every day. At the federal level now, there is an absolute feeding frenzy to try to bring those new pad technologies and mobile devices into the federal government. And moreover, a lot of the folks want to use one device for their personal stuff and also for the business side of the house. Now, we have had technology for decades almost now, going back to when I used to work at NSA back in the early 90s. Trust technology, being able to separate data logically, we've known how to do that. Do we do that routinely now on most of these devices? No. So using technology wisely, and your job is really tough because you've got to kind of stand up to this technology revolution and say, not to say no, you can't use the technology, but make sure your bosses understand the risk in bringing that new technology into the organization. And offer up good solutions. That's what risk management's all about. Not saying no, making sure your eyes are wide open so you can weigh the benefits of using that mobile technology or cloud computing and the risks that go with the same type of technology. It's two sides of the same coin. You have to be able to balance that very carefully. And sometimes the best decision is to say no. We have a situation in the federal government where we get a half an hour for lunch break, and a lot of our federal employees will routinely go from their workstations and they'll go out to websites. Lowe's, Home Depot, they'll be looking at stuff for the weekend. And a lot of them don't understand that with one click on that URL, they're bringing in lots and lots of malware to their workstation, and then when they go back to work after lunch, that spreads like wildfire throughout the corporate network. This has happened to major federal agencies downtown in Washington, D.C., where they've lost their entire corporate network because of one employee clicking on one web link during lunchtime. And when you go to them and say, well, wouldn't it be better to have a room down the hall with some low-cost terminals and take those web surfing sessions off the corporate network? Well, the answer comes back, that's too hard. We don't want to inconvenience our employees. So I think it was Clint Eastwood had a great line once in the movie. He said, are you feeling lucky today? You know, that's really what your job boils down to, making sure the bosses understand what that risk really is, eyes wide open, and then they have to make the decision, obviously, to move forward or not. We're going to a lot more continuous monitoring now. You've heard, we've had a process in the federal government called certification and accreditation. How many folks have heard that term before? Well, over the years, it got a little bit too paperwork driven, if you will. And it's not necessarily it was a bad process, but it was developed during the days when we had mainframes and, you know, things were a lot different than they are today, where the threat space in the last 5 years has evolved tremendously. So we had kind of a static process with a real-time adversary out there, which didn't make a lot of sense. So we're moving to more of an agile type of a process now, where near real-time risk management is the kind of the buzzword of the day, and continuous monitoring. And this diagram here comes out of the publication I mentioned a few minutes ago. Special Publication 800-39. If you haven't read this publication, I would really recommend you do. This takes a strategic perspective on risk management and cybersecurity first. What it requires is that the organization establish 3 tiers of risk management and cybersecurity operations. At the first tier is the governance level. This is where you have senior leaders involved with the CISO and the CIO, establishing a risk management strategy for the organization. And what is that strategy about? Well, it talks about things like How are we going to assess risk as an organization? What kind of tools, techniques, procedures are we going to use? And once we run all that stuff, how are we going to evaluate the risks that we find out that we have? What's going to be our corporate, enterprise-wide risk response strategy? Are we going to accept certain risks? Are we going to reject others out of hand? Are we going to mitigate risks by applying additional safeguards and countermeasures, security controls? Are we going to transfer risk to somebody else through insurance, for example? Or are we going to share risk with another organization? Those are all options that you can have. What is the level of risk tolerance within your organization? Risk tolerance. How much risk is enough before you put your core missions and business operations in undue risk? You have to know where that risk tolerance level is, because today, with scarce resources, every time you apply an additional security control, management, operational, or technical, it's going to cost money. And those are decisions that are going to be made very carefully today. So understanding where that cut point is very, very important. And last but not least, your strategy ought to look at how do you monitor risk over time. The risk that you accept today is not going to be the same risk even this afternoon or tonight or tomorrow, because one thing we know is clear: everything is changing. The threats, the environment of operations, you may move to a new facility, the hardware, the software, the firmware, constantly changing, putting in a new service pack, patching this, adding a new firewall. There's constant change and churn within these systems and the environment where those systems operate, and good risk management involves understanding change and being able to react to that change. Now, at Tier 2, that risk management strategy that you developed, that we just talked about, then is pushed down to Tier 2. And Tier 2 is where all of your mission and business processes get created. That's where enterprise architecture gets developed. And more importantly, from your perspective, and this is why the enterprise architect should be your best friend, they need you to understand how to integrate an information security architecture embedded within that enterprise architecture. And what does that mean? That means when you develop your enterprise architecture, they're looking at consolidating, optimizing, standardizing, building it leaner and meaner, more efficient. But your job then is, through the security architecture, to design a roadmap of how all of the safeguards and countermeasures, management, operational, and technical, are deployed across the infrastructure and the systems within your enterprise. It's a command and control problem. And understanding where your forces are going to be deployed is very important, because you don't have unlimited resources. And that's why we categorize our information to make sure the most critical data is, in some sense, isolated from the non-critical data, so we can afford more protection to the stuff that really makes a difference. Now, that Tier 2, coming out of Tier 2, you have that roadmap, and then Tier 3 is where you actually bend sheet metal and code. That's where you build the system. Many of these systems today come from commercial products. We don't build a lot of things from scratch anymore. We're taking those commercial operating systems, the databases, the network devices, and we're going through a systems integration process. One of the documents we're going to be developing next year supports this new strategy. It's going to be a systems and security engineering publication. How do you effectively apply best practices when you're building these systems and trying to enforce a security policy, not just across one system, but across all systems and across the entire enterprise? So this is a change in strategy. You can see, instead of going under the hood and looking at every vulnerability, now we're going back up to the top of the organization, and we're starting from the strategic level. And we're trying to figure out, what kind of a card do we really need? How do we build it so it has more resilience to it, the systems aspect, if you will. So this is all about an evolution now, change from what we call compliance, where you have a checklist of things to do, and once you do those things, you're all done. Well, we found that compliance with regard to checklists today is ineffective, because the adversaries don't care about your checklist. They can read your checklist. They can see that you've done all 10 of your things and you've gone home. They're going to move on to item number 11 that's not on your checklist. And so we've got to be able to have a strategy that keeps ahead and kind of gets rid of that static, mentality of the checklist, counting systems, counting number of things that have been certified and accredited, and really get back to, what does good cybersecurity really mean? And to me, it means building stronger systems, better products, better systems, fewer vulnerabilities out the back end. Well, we talked about enterprise architecture, and again, if you leave here with one big idea today, it's that we have to get down to less complexity in these systems today, and the architecture is the only way to do that when you've got an organization that's fairly complicated. Lots of missions, lots of business processes, and in order to do that, you have to have some kind of an organizing construct, and that's what enterprise architecture can do. Engineering approach is critical. You know, today, if you're an enterprise architect, I would absolutely make sure that my security folks, my privacy individuals, people who have privacy responsibilities, and my security engineering team were all in the same room together with the best threat information that you can possibly get to them. If you can get classified access to threat data, that's great. If you want to go to open source, there's a tremendous amount of open source threat information out there. Some of the companies produce it, like Symantec and some of the other companies that are out there in the space, interacting all the time, looking at the threats and how they are emerging. Wherever you get it, make sure you get it. And get those folks into the same room so that you can build the integrated project team. Architects can't do it by themselves, neither can you. We've got to join forces here so we really can stand up against what I know to be a very, very dangerous and sophisticated adversary. One of our other publications you may have come across is the 800-37. This is the new way we do certification and accreditation. We're not just focusing on the testing and evaluation and the risk acceptance. We're now going back and using this framework in a life cycle approach. And you can see all 6 steps there take you through kind of a life cycle approach, starting with understanding the criticality or sensitivity of your information, categorizing data. And we have 3 different categories. You can have low impact data, moderate, or high impact data. High impact data that resides in a system, if it's compromised, can have severe or catastrophic effects on your mission operations. An example, as I used earlier, is the air traffic control system. If that system goes down, the pilots fly blind, and we have people's lives in jeopardy. On the other side, you all know there's information within your systems today that not that important, low impact, limited adverse effect if it's compromised, or if that system goes down with that information in it. Now, that categorization step is critical because you use that criticality and sensitivity of the information, the value, if you will, to select an appropriate set of safeguards and countermeasures or security controls. And today, every federal agency has great flexibility. They start with kind of a starting set of controls based upon the low, moderate, or high impact category, and then they go through a tailoring process to make sure that those controls, when they end up in their security plan, are exactly what they need, targeted to their mission and their operations. And then, of course, after that, you can see the life cycle goes to implementation, assessment, authorization, which is the risk acceptance step, and then finally to continuous monitoring. Part of that 3-tiered approach, also what comes with that is a risk management approach as well in the same publication, 839. Again, it's a very simple process where we assess risk, we respond, and then we monitor risk over time. It's kind of a cyclical cycle. The risk framing part is where you establish kind of your organizational view of how you want to manage risk. This is where you define your assumptions, your constraints, your priorities, trade-offs, risk tolerance. All of that establishes the context of how your organization is intending to manage risk. And then once you establish that risk frame of that context, you'll go through these assessment, response, and monitoring steps over and over as the threat evolves and as you respond to that threat. I mentioned the dual protection strategies. Today we are pretty much focused on strategy 1, which is boundary protection. But as I mentioned earlier, the 80% that we can stop with the traditional boundary protection measures don't work very well on those high-end APT, the advanced persistent threat. So we're moving to the secondary strategy, which is called agile defense. Now, agile defense assumes that the adversary now has penetrated your perimeter. And they're not on the outside trying to get in, they're on the inside now, they're operating. And you have to be able to do one important thing. You have to be able to limit the damage the adversary can do. It's called time on target. The quicker you can get rid of the adversary, the malware, the less time that adversary has to do damage. So currently, we have some things that can help. Certainly, virtualization. virtual machines with malware, the malware goes away when the VM goes away. And so we have more and more virtualization techniques taking place today within lots of systems. That can be very helpful. Building smaller, more targeted systems and subsystems where you can isolate critical data and protect that data to a much higher degree than if it were just strewn out throughout the general information system. Encrypting of data at rest is still a great thing. You know, after we had the VA laptop incident about 4 or 5 years ago where the VA laptop ended up going home with a federal employee and it was stolen from the car with a hard drive. On that hard drive, 26.5 million records of personally identifiable information of every veteran. And so that told us something very important. We weren't using some of the fundamental technologies like full disk encryption to prevent that kind of a vulnerability. Now, almost everything we carry, whether it's a mobile device or whether it's a laptop, full disk encrypted, and again, the value is in the information. It's not in the hardware and the software of the device. So we've got a lot of things, and one thing to remember, though, about the encryption, the best crypto in the world is only as good as the key management system and how that's being protected. So, you know, type 1 crypto from NSA, if you've got weak key management on either end of that, then that crypto can be worthless because once you get the key management system compromised, everything else comes down with it. Limitation of privileges, you've all seen WikiLeaks, big story this past year. Again, an individual, bad actor, we knew he was a bad actor, had unlimited access to highly critical and sensitive data. And with that, we didn't take away the privileges, and the rest is history. So least privilege, one of our founding fathers types of things that we've known for years, fundamentals. We don't necessarily always implement some of the things we know how to do very routinely. Reconstitution to a known secure state, always a good way to get rid of any kind of malware. Now there's some research going on in the DC area, one of the universities, on how do you reconstitute a system almost in near real time. Now you can visualize in the future where you could reconstitute so quickly that it wouldn't make any difference what adversaries did coming through the boundary. They were never going to be on target long enough to do damage. That's the future, but we're not there yet. So we've got to do everything today with what's available today with our conventional technologies. At the end of the day, your job will always be about defense in depth. A range of security controls provided across management, operational, technical. A lot of the stuff on the right-hand side, technology, hardware, software, firmware controls. On the left-hand side, some people think this is the softer side of cybersecurity, but I'll tell you, it's every bit as important as the technology. Good security policies, good continuity of operations planning, incident response, education, training, awareness, physical security, personnel, all of that happens outside of the box. And we can never forget that defense in depth requires a total, holistic view of that system and the environment of operations. Two of the worst breaches that we've seen this year, Stuxnet and WikiLeaks, were not about technology breaches in total. There were failures of personnel security in a big way that allowed those very, very bad attacks to occur. Well, I think we've got a couple more minutes here. I want to talk a little bit about continuous monitoring. If you go to our website, we have a brand new publication. It's the special publication 800-137. That's on continuous monitoring. It gives some new techniques and procedures on how to do this ongoing monitoring so you can understand the current and ongoing security state of your system over time. Again, these documents are all up there and they're there for your use. Again, a few tips in the front of the, you'll find all this in 800-137, developing a monitoring strategy, making sure you understand the measures and the metrics of what you're looking for, what you're monitoring over time. All these things really come into play to build a stronger monitoring program. I think we're coming up on the end of the hour here, so I'm going to leave you with a couple of slides on the core publications that have been worked on now in our new partnership. NIST is working with the Defense Department and the intelligence community, all 17 agencies under the Office of Director of National Intelligence. We've already built 5 publications now. They're on the website, ready for you to use. The first one is the one I talked about a lot, enterprise-wide risk management. Second one is the CNA process, that risk framework. The third one is a brand new risk assessment guideline, which is still in draft, but available on the website. Publication 853, all of those security controls across 18 families, all of those controls are out there for you to take advantage of. And the 53 Alpha document provides all of the assessment procedures that you can use to make sure those controls are actually effective once you've deployed those controls to your systems and the environments of operation. Have a big update coming up on 53 in December. About a month from now, you're going to see our new control catalog. It'll be out in public draft at that time. Lots of new stuff going in there with regard to application security, insider threat, industrial control systems, mobile security, cloud computing. So stay tuned for that. Again, I know we're up against the clock. I want to thank you all again for giving me the chance to speak to you during lunch. I'll be around the rest of the day. Our contact information is here. Go to our website, send me an email, and again, we're here to help you build your programs. If we can be of assistance, please don't hesitate to call on us. Thanks very much, guys. Appreciate it.
Next session will be starting in 5 minutes.